Get ready to rumble. Shilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. I had the great privilege of growing up in Southern California at a time when the Golden State truly was golden. And the history of my family's arrival in California was they all came through Ellis Island at one point or another, or at least the vast majority of my family did, wound up in the Midwest, and in the 1950s decided to follow the dream and go to California. And I'm really glad that they did. As a young kid in Southern California, it took me a while to realize how cool it actually was to be living there at that time. Of course, I didn't have any experience living anywhere else, so I didn't really know. But I did enjoy my life. I enjoyed the wonderful things about being in Southern California. I just didn't know what it was like relative to the rest of the country. When I was a teenager, I took a trip to Illinois to visit a friend who was in California and had moved back home to Illinois. And what I saw there when I visited him and some other cousins who never made it out to California was that there was great envy amongst the young people for those who lived in Southern California. I was almost treated like some sort of an oddity, but people had lots of questions about what it was like living in California. There was envy and there was mystique. And quite frankly, it was really a lot of fun to be the center of all of that when I visited the Midwest that time. The things that were really good about Southern California then, and some of them are still there, was the near perfect weather. Very little humidity. Every day was a beautiful day. Now, it did get hot, and sometimes it stayed hot till very late at night, almost never cooling down. The summers and the late falls, which they used to call Indian summer, those were super hot, but without the humidity, it was certainly tolerable. There was a beautiful natural environment. I grew up at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains, and any day we could look up and see Mount Baldy covered with snow. We see trees all over the mountains. Now, of course, that came with the risk of fires, and we certainly lived through a few fire scares over the years, but it was just beautiful to behold. When I was a kid, it was super easy for us to go to the beach, just hop in the car or even get on the beach bus. We had public transportation that would take us 45 minutes down to Santa Monica Beach, and we could hang out at the beach all day. Again, almost always a perfect day at the beach. We also used to go to the desert in Southern California, as we were not far away, maybe an hour to an hour and a half from a place called Victorville. We could take our motorcycles out and spend all day in the desert, sometimes camping overnight. Hardly see anybody out there, despite the fact that even then California was very densely populated. But you could go out to these places, you could camp, you could take motorcycles, you could boat. It was just amazing. And of course, speaking of boating, we would go to the Colorado River. I had an uncle who had a boat. We would go rent a property down on the Colorado River and spend a week or two down there water skiing and just enjoying being in the water. I think my favorite place in all of Southern California was Santa Catalina Island, popularized in a song, 26 miles across the sea, a very small town about 1 mile square called Avalon, which was the main place where people lived on Catalina. There were very few cars on Santa Catalina Island, and I vacationed there regularly for many years as a child, and then as an adult used to go over there and enjoyed just time being there in the off-season. Not when it was overflowing with 15,000 people, but in the time of year when tourists were not there, and there were maybe about 5,000 people in all of the island. Southern California was known for the car culture, and although I never had a car to brag about, there were a lot of people that had really nice cars, and it made a name for the car culture across the nation. There were great restaurants and a great variety of foods. They were all excellent, very reasonable prices, some even downright cheap because of all of the competition in Southern California. Again, just unique and delicious, a great way to spend your time just eating at the many restaurants across Southern California. I was involved in real estate sales, and one of the things that always had me interested was seeing various architectural styles. Again, California, Southern California in particular, very unique in the styles of houses, Spanish houses, prairie-style houses, craftsman, Frank Lloyd Wright influenced houses. In fact, some actual Frank Lloyd Wright houses, which I had a chance to see while I was working in real estate there. Even the traditional, what they would call here a ranch house, was beautiful and beautifully done. Music and the arts, we had Hollywood, and we had the production of music, the Capitol Records building. Many things about Southern California which would attract people there. And every year when they had the Rose Parade and people would look there and see how beautiful the weather was on January 1st, they'd say, you know what, we're coming to California. So how did California die? Well, as I witnessed this happening, I could see that problems were ahead. There were too many people coming too fast. There was a lot of unchecked immigration, both legal and illegal. At the time, there were many people coming from China with boatloads of cash, just trying to get out of mainland China and investing in the place where I grew up, a city called Arcadia, California. And so they would go around to the neighborhoods and they would offer people who were living in the homes they maybe paid $30,000, $40,000, or $50,000 for back in the late 50s or early 60s, and offer them cash, anywhere up to $1 million for maybe a 2 or 3 bedroom home, and then come in and build a multi-generational home that was many sizes larger in square footage and kind of change the character of all of these neighborhoods in that city, but in many cities across Southern California. There was also unchecked illegal immigration, which led to many societal problems, including balkanization by language and culture. A lot of divisions in Southern California. Although we had a rich culture which was enriched by people coming from other places, there also was a failure to assimilate in many cases, and so there were a lot of divisions. One of the things that was most problematic was the rise in crime in Southern California. I grew up in and around Pasadena, and I could see the graffiti encroaching into the neighborhoods. There were places that seemed to be safe, but there was a lot of drug dealing going on, and for some reason, whatever that was, the local police did not seem to be able to get a handle on these problems, and crime was increasing, taking over neighborhoods, and making it a less desirable place to live. Where I lived was relatively safe. However, it wasn't far, just a few blocks away, that there were murders and a lot of gang crimes going on, and we just had to hope that it didn't encroach into our own neighborhood. Also, the cost of living rose dramatically, often fueled by people coming in from other places with lots of money, but also the desirability of the place, the inability to manage the growth in such a way that made sense and did not cause the problems that we had, and also the cost of living going through the roof. When we left Southern California in the late 90s, a standard 3-bedroom house, maybe 12 to 1,500 square feet, a nice tidy house in a nice neighborhood would be at least $500,000. That house today is probably $1.5 million. Who can afford to live there? We certainly couldn't. It's one of the reasons we left. And I think what we've seen also and how California died is the fall of conservative representation in government. It's very hard to imagine now, looking at the political governance of California, Gavin Newsom and the Democrats controlling everything, Republicans even having a hard time getting on the ballot. But at the time, and when we left in 1998, California was a conservative place. We had a governor by the name of Pete Wilson, a Republican. The California Assembly, which is similar to our General Assembly and our delegates, we had assemblymen in California, and the Assembly was majority conservative. That all fell the summer that we moved in 1998, as the Democrats took the governor's house and the Democrats took the California Assembly, never to return to Republican hands. And of course, following that, the rise of high taxes and social liberalism has essentially killed the goose that laid the golden egg in California. It's not a place I could ever live again. I don't see it going back. I feel terrible for the people living there, and there are many instructive things that we can learn as Virginians and people in other places of the country about the California dream and how it died. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in just a moment.
Support this podcast online at shillingshow.com.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. Border Hawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Schilling Show Unleashed.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome John Cox, a former GOP gubernatorial candidate and head of Change CA. And John, welcome to the Schilling Show. Tell us the present state of California for people who are not following closely.
Well, thank you, Rob. Well, if you have a lot of money, if you're a Silicon Valley billionaire or you've got enough assets and income to be in the top 1%, you know, you're enjoying the great life out here because the weather is fantastic. The natural beauty is great. You probably live in a very nice home in a very nice coastal community. But if you're not in those categories, it's a struggle for a lot of people. This is the state that has the highest tax rates in the country, but frankly, also the highest rate of poverty. The homeless situation is an absolute disgrace. We have about 13% of the population, but about 25% of the homeless population. We have the highest housing, gasoline, electricity, water prices in the country. Water is actually one of the big issues because it's going to be rationed pretty soon because we haven't built a reservoir in probably 30 years. And we also have an education system now that spends $100 billion a year and competes with Mississippi for some of the lowest rates of success in the country. It's hard to believe that the people that are leading the state continue to get elected, but they manage to get control and get financial control of the state in the 1980s and 1990s, and they have really used that position to cement their political control. And so they have now turned California into the laboratory for every horrible or socialistic idea that has just resulted in just an absolute mismanagement of the state.
You know, John, it's interesting and very sad. I grew up in Southern California, and when I left, I was living in a place called Sierra Madre, which I still love. And if I could have picked Sierra Madre up and moved it out of California, I would never have left my entire life. And so I guess the question that I have is you talk about the people who aren't in the 1% category. How on earth are they surviving, $2,000-$3,000 a month for rent, or houses that cost in that area now around $1 million for a 2 or 3 bedroom house? How do people do that?
Well, in some areas, by the way, $1 million hardly buys you 1,000 square feet.
Yeah.
There's a struggle. I mean, a lot of people in the Bay Area, you've seen the surveys, they're living 2 and 3 families in a 1,500 square foot apartment or house. It's just a tougher life, obviously. Contrary, the compensating balance, I suppose, is the fact that our weather is just still the greatest in the country, and the natural beauty. You can drive to the ocean or you can drive to the mountains and probably the same time in many places, in an hour or so. It's hard to think that you could do that in many other places in the country. And so, you take the bad with the good a little bit, but you just grin and bear it. Some are not, as you know. I mean, you're an early refugee, I understand, but, there are others that now have continued to take up residency in Idaho, Arizona, and Nevada, and in Texas and other states, fleeing the high cost and high taxes that California is now known for, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm really curious about the outward migration. When we left California, we had
Yeah.
certainly considered going to Oregon or Washington. I'm glad we didn't go either one of those places. But there was a whole lot of resentment in the surrounding states about Californians fleeing the state and driving up real estate prices. So I'm really curious to know what it's like for outbound Californians today when they land in these various surrounding states.
From what I've read, Boise's housing market is one of the hottest in the country because it's just being pushed up by people who have fled California. So it's not hard to see why, because people, again, in California are facing all these costs of living, and they look at a city like Boise, or they go to Las Vegas, or they go to Phoenix or Tucson, and they can see that they can buy twice the house for half the cost or less. And that makes a huge difference in your lifestyle. Rob, you know it, but in recent years, it's become even more accelerated. Californians now pay 5 times what people in Texas pay for electricity. For instance, in a small home in San Diego, you might average $400 or $500 a month in electricity cost. That would be maybe $100 a month in Texas. I mean, think about somebody making, a middle income person making $80,000 or $100,000 a year. Those are big differences in what they can afford and how they can send their kids to school and vacations and other things that they can, have in their lifestyle that they might not be able to if they lived in California still.
John Cox, you've decided to do something about this, and I want you to tell us about Change CA. Now, this, first off, is a nonpartisan effort. Tell us why that is and why that's important.
Well, it's very important. First of all, I ran for governor in 2018 because I saw this situation. And one of the things I want to emphasize to your listeners, Rob, is that 95% of these conditions I described in the first few minutes of our, podcast here are government caused. They're not preordained. They're not, the result of the weather or excessive demand or a crowded population. They're caused by a government that loves regulation, that benefits a small group of people, usually, employee unions or trial lawyers or lobbyists of some sort who get their hooks into Sacramento. So that's really one of the reasons I ran for governor to begin with. After I lost, I took a look at what the landscape was, and I said, well, how are we going to get this change? And I saw that California has this incredibly large block of registered voters, almost 7 million, bigger than the population of most states. These are registered voters who are not affiliated with either major party. You might call them independent, but there's all kinds of people within that ranks too. But the big deal is that they don't want to be a part of the Democrat or the Republican parties, because in California, they believe, rightly or wrongly, and mostly rightly, that these politicians who lead these parties have basically sold themselves out to these lobbyists and these funding sources. One of the reasons for that, obviously, is that California has this humongous population. It has 11 media markets. So the cost of running for office in California is monumental. And so these funding sources that fund these campaigns basically control the state. And because of that, they get their way with legislation and regulation and benefits and taxes and things in Sacramento. And the rest of the people in California who don't have that kind of clout, which is, 80 or 90% of the people in the state, basically pay the freight and have to support all these things. I decided that what the best way and the only way probably to turn this state around and change that dynamic in Sacramento is to get to these 7 million voters who represent a huge voting bloc and get on their doorstep and talk to them and convince them that there are solutions to these problems, that we can have lower housing prices and lower gasoline prices and lower electricity prices and lower water prices, that we can deal with the fires, that we can have a better education system, that these things just require better management and taking the power away from these interest groups. And we're trying it out in 2020 in a few places just to test the concept. So far it's working. We'll find out next Tuesday how well it works. And then if it works, our plan is to take this statewide and use it to basically transform the state back to a livable and affordable place to live.
John Cox, are you running candidates?
No. This is a nonpartisan organization. You cannot, under the law in California, of course, written by these same politicians who are funded by these interest groups, you can't have a nonpartisan nonprofit that supports candidates. But we can talk about issues. We can talk about the housing crisis. We can talk about why homelessness is so bad. We can talk about why our education system needs competition and accountability to deliver better results. We can talk about the solutions and the problems and convince people that they need to take notice and look at the candidates, whoever they may be, and figure out who to vote for based on how they'll deal with these solutions. But we can't go to the door and say, vote for John Smith or, Joe Muckluck. We can't do that. We have to be nonpartisan, non-political that way.
Something else I saw that was very interesting in your approach to all of this is you're avoiding some of the hot button partisan issues. What are the issues that you're avoiding, and why are you doing that?
Well, we're not going to be pushing the major social issues like abortion or gay marriage or gun rights and things like that, because those have been dealt with by the federal government, and the U.S. Supreme Court in many cases has weighed in. The state doesn't have as much of a say over those issues as many others. And so we want to steer clear, because frankly, the politicians use those issues to cement themselves in position. And then once they're in those positions, then they raise all the money and do all the things that the interest groups want and make life expensive and basically unlivable for a lot of people. We're going to try to avoid those hot button divisive issues and focus on the bread and butter ones that really are making life so difficult here.
We're talking with John Cox of Change CA. I want to get to some of the issues now, and I think this is really, really important. I want to start right off with homelessness. Now, homelessness was a problem when I lived in California. I would imagine it's magnitudes worse, and there's very little enforcement. What do you see, and what do you propose?
Rob, you would visit Los Angeles and San Francisco and even San Diego and even a lot of small cities now, maybe even Sierra Madre, and you'd look at the situation, you'd see tents on the streets and, people defecating and urinating on the streets, just living a life of desperation, frankly, just outside. It's no life. And you'd look at it, you'd almost cry, because it's just such a waste of humanity. And not only that, just unsanitary and disruptive to the rest of the people who aren't. And you'd say the politicians have failed because they believe, or they have tried without success, to apply a housing first approach, which means what they do is they put up tents, they buy hotel rooms or whole hotels now. They're actually going in and buying hotels and putting people in them. And the trouble with that is that 75, 80, 90% in some of the cases of these people that are living on the street are doing so because they're either mentally ill or substance addicted. And, if you don't deal with that problem, you put them in a hotel room, they're just going to leave the hotel room at various intervals and go get their alcohol or drugs and then go back to the room. And that's not going to help them. That's not going to end up curing them or producing somebody that's going to be able to take care of themselves. And you can see that. Even in San Francisco, they actually give them free needles because they're believing that, at least they may live on the street and they may shoot up, but at least they're not going to have hepatitis that's going to infect the rest of the population. Well, that's just a cop-out and not a solution. We're talking about a solution that involves treatment first, partnering with organizations that have demonstrated over the years that they can treat these illnesses and basically reclaim people's lives from this kind of desperation. to us, that's really what will solve this problem, instead of just relocating it to someplace that's away from population.
You know, John, when we lived in Southern California, we'd watch the Rose Parade every year, and I lived close enough at one point to just walk down to the route on Colorado Boulevard. But I remember my parents saying, you know, every time they show the Rose Parade and the Rose Bowl on New Year's Day, it is a magnet to people across the country who see the beautiful weather of California and say, I'm going there. I would imagine that that effect also attracts people who are homeless, looking for a free hotel room or just easy weather. How do you deal with that?
I'm one of those people. I visited Pasadena and I saw the Rose Parade, and it was wonderful and I loved it. I mean, I think the answer is not to just end the Rose Parade or end all these other great things that attract people to California. I think it's to make it so that the state will never probably be the cheapest state to live in. It's got too many attractions for that, but it doesn't have to be just so excessively expensive and unlivable. People, it's just that way. I mean, it doesn't have to be that if we had the right management. I guess that's the point I'm making, and that is we could deal with these issues and make a dent in homelessness and deal with the fires and deal with bringing down to some rational level the cost of living here, so that you don't have to be in the top 1%. You might have to make a little bit more than you do in the rest of the country, but you're not going to have to, be so incredibly rich. Because I kind of tell you, Rob, it's not sustainable. You can't have a real sustainable economy without having a vibrant middle class that's there to power purchases and supplies for everybody else. California now has this incredible inequality where you've got to either be really rich or you're very poor and very struggling. I really believe we could have a middle class and just need some change in policies to get that going.
John Cox, let's talk about the policy changes regarding cost of living and specifically the cost of housing.
You have to understand what's kind of driving a lot of the policy in this state. The politicians use the environment to a large degree for that purpose. President Reagan and other governors, when they were governor of California, signed laws. Reagan, when he was governor here, signed a law called the California Environmental Quality Act back in the 70s. That was designed to make it so that smog and other problems of that era were no longer a factor. That's largely happened in many ways. The smog and air pollution are greatly reduced in the state since that time frame, and we certainly probably have some longer way to go. That's happened. Now, the trouble is that law has been basically morphed into over time by environmentalists and trial lawyers and other people to just produce incredible amounts of litigation and delay in housing production. The typical housing project in California, because of these environmental laws, can take 8 to 10 years and involve massive amounts of regulation and litigation. Those are costs that are just built into the price of the housing and really drive it up. Along with that, California has enacted all kinds of other regulations and mandates. For instance, now you have to have rain barrels to catch water that might fall from the sky when there's rain here. Again, why have they mandated that? Because we haven't built reservoirs, we haven't done recycling, we haven't done desalination, which you would need to do for a growing population. And so they're making the homeowners incur these mandates. That's driving up the cost as well. You've got to attack these, cost increases. And, housing is probably the biggest one, I argue, Rob, because that's my business. I build and manage apartments in the Midwest, which is where I'm from. I build in Indiana, for example, for 1/5 the costs in California. Well, when you have to pay so much to live housing-wise, that drives up the cost of salaries. Well, those salaries then drive up the cost of everything: food, healthcare, taxes, because governmental budgets involve mostly salaries. So you've got all these costs cycling through derived from housing, which multiply themselves in the cost of everything else and continue to drive up salaries even more, to the point where the cost structure becomes untenable for most people. And I think if you attack the housing crisis itself, you end up being able to moderate a lot of these costs and bring them down. And I think that's the way that we would get a more affordable system here.
I would also like to talk about the COVID lockdowns that are going on. And I'm hearing reports from Dennis Prager, who I listen to regularly. He's on our radio station here. But masks between bites at restaurants, arresting the lone surfer, and then the Thanksgiving edicts, which I could hardly believe. What is the present state of the lockdowns?
I had this disease. I got it early in March. One of my friends ended up in an ICU. It's no easy thing. It's certainly a dangerous disease, and we ought to be holding China accountable for unleashing it on the world. Unfortunately, we're dealing with it right now, and we're not prepared to do that, I guess. But we've got to deal with it. My belief is, with any kind of risk like this, you've got to isolate and quarantine people who are most vulnerable, which would be our elderly and those with pre-existing medical conditions. I recovered fine. I'm 65 years old, but I'm in pretty good shape. I walk a golf course, a few days a week when I have the time, and so I keep myself in shape. We've got to make sure that the economy is good. We can not clamp down on the economy, which supplies the wherewithal for all the services we have and all the life that we've built for ourselves. I can think of nothing worse than keeping this economy under a wet blanket and endangering our future. That there's a marked increase in suicide hotline calls and drug abuse and alcohol abuse and domestic issues brought on by the economic destruction that this clampdown has cost. I would have gone full boat into testing early on. I think if there's one thing that we would do differently now, it's that we would just put a super emphasis on easy and cheap testing, so that we would have some idea of who was infected and who wasn't, and be able to self-isolate ourselves away from people and try to limit the spread of this disease. Unfortunately, that wasn't done in California very much. Mr. Newsom dragged his feet on letting pharmacies test people and getting involved the university laboratories that we have all through the state. I think that was a major error, and he's continued to clamp down on life. I think we're doing a tremendous disservice to our children. I have a 15-year-old who can't get to high school. She's doing it from home, and it's just not the optimum way to educate our children and have them compete in the world. I think that's going to really redound to our detriment when we look back at this in a few years. I really think that this is a bad approach to take, and I worry that it's going to have some real negative effects, going forward.
John Cox, I've noted at least 2, if not 3 or 4 efforts at splitting the state of California into smaller regions. And I wanted to get your take. I know that's not what you're doing here, but I want to get your take on that proposal.
First of all, creating new states is the province of the federal government to some degree, and it requires their approval. I mean, I think some people have suggested it with Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. to no avail. I find it hard to believe they're going to end up doing that in California. But, it's not going to solve the problems either, Rob. And I think that's one of the reasons it fails. Right now we have a big state, 40 million people, where the political leadership basically bows down to these funding interests in Sacramento. If you split the state into 3, you're going to have 3 13 million person states, which is still going to put it in the top of the population rankings. And you're still going to have the interest groups controlling the state, those three states. You're not going to basically change the problem. You're just going to make three more dysfunctional states, I think. I think the way you solve the problem is attack it head on and do something about these funding interests and get more people active and interested in government so that we don't have these special interests in control. It has to come down to voters, Rob. It has to come down to voters finally paying attention and believing that there's a better way to manage this state and do things so that they don't have these incredible costs and incredible problems like homelessness and the fire damage. We haven't even talked about the fires here. We live in fear of these fires, and now we have rolling blackouts impacting the state because of that. There are ways to manage around these things, and we just need to get people interested in them. Splitting up the state, I think, just doesn't, just defers it to three more, dysfunctional states.
Finally, John, what would be the measure of your success? When could you look back on these efforts and say, we accomplished what we intended?
Well, I think it's when we change one-party government, and get some political competition in the state and really address some of these dysfunctional aspects. And I think that's eminently possible and probable if we get more people to pay attention. That's what this effort at Change California is all about. That's irony of this whole situation. There's just a need to get more people to pay attention. We can have a great education system. Tenure is not preordained. It's not in the Constitution. It's not the natural way of things. It's being put upon us by political influence. And what we have to do is we just have to get people to pay attention and believe that there's leadership that can make these differences. And I really believe that that's possible. It's happened before. It's happened in other states. I really believe that this effort we're making with independent voters could inject that political competition. And once we have that, policy will flow. We just, have to light that fire and get people to believe that it's possible. And I think that's going to happen. I really do. I think this effort's going to be successful here. And I think people, when we take this statewide in 2022, I think people in this state are ready for change. I think they've just been beaten down. They've heard of so many of their friends that have left the state. They don't want to leave themselves because they love the weather. They love the natural beauty. They want to stay here. Their families are here. Their children are here. They want to stay. When they see that there's a possibility that get these things corrected, I think they'll stay and they'll vote for different leadership.
John, tell us where we can get more information about Change CA.
The best place, obviously, the website, change-ca.org, change-ca.org. And they can look, my name up, John Cox, in the internet, and they'll see articles. And I've been on the media all across the state talking about this and, getting some interest peaked. We've got hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. We've raised money, but we obviously need more help. The powers that be, the cronies, the corrupt, they're in control in Sacramento, and they're not going to give it up lightly. So we have to do what we can. I'm not making money from this. I'm a businessman. I've done this because I want my daughter to live in an affordable place, and I don't need to do it, but I want to do it because I want to make this state what it should be, and that's my life's mission right now.
John Cox, I wish you the very best in your efforts to change California, and I thank you so much for joining us here today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you, Rob. Great to be with you.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.